Bottom of the rib cage, right about here. Cut down around the umbilical cord and then make my two flaps so that I can fold this whole thing open to see the internal structures. So again, finding where it sort of ends clearly. About here. I'm going to start off to one side just because. Now what I've done here is I cut through the skin, but I didn't cut through the muscle. It's always better to cut shallow because you can always go back and do it again. If you cut too deeply, you can't fix it. So always in terms of this, the measure twice, cut once thing you hear about doing carpentry doesn't apply here. It's better to cut twice and have the first one be too shallow and then recut than it is to cut too deeply the first time because you don't get a redo option. So in my case, I didn't cut deeply enough, so I could do a little more. So at this point now, I'm starting to get the opening that I'll need. And you can use your fingers, you can use a probe to help lift up these tissues and make it a little easier to cut them. There we go. So here now I'm definitely through, and I'm getting into the area where there are actual organs that I don't want to damage. So I've made my cut across on this side. One way to help minimize damage, as I'm going to do, is I'll lift up the skin before I cut it. That way I'm pulling it away from the organs. I'm also keeping the blunt side of the scissors downward towards the pig's organs because, again, the sharp side is more likely to accidentally poke something I don't want it to damage. So insert with the blunt side down. And I've got my flap across the top. There's still some connective tissue and stuff, but that's all right. That's easy enough to fix later. Then I want to cut downward, and again, it's really hard to do this with these stupid lights in the way. You want to cut around the umbilical cord so you don't damage that, because we'll need that later. So just set up doing this on screen. And I'm going to cut across. And as I do this, I'm making the flaps that will allow me to pull this apart. Notice there's this connective membrane, this sort of translucent membrane in there that you can break with your fingers, with the scissors, with forceps, whatever. That's part of the peritoneum, the membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. And so that's going to be covering the organs to protect them. And in our case, we'll have to cut through that to see things, but I'll leave it sort of intact there for a second. And then on this side, I'll cut across as well. And you can see I've got my flaps on either side mostly set up. The last thing I'm going to do is pull the umbilical cord downward towards the animal's tail, and you'll find there's going to be resistance there. Even if I cut this membrane, there's still going to be resistance, and that resistance is going to be because, well, I cut it ahead of time, but just now, there is a blood vessel that goes from the umbilical cord into the liver. That would be the umbilical vein. So when you start pulling that across so that it can pull downward, you want to cut the umbilical vein, but you want to try to keep a piece of it on the liver so you can identify it next week.
So it goes from the umbilical cord
to the liver. And so as I fold this down, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see on here those umbilical arteries that we talked about before as these two pink tubes on either side of that flap that I folded down. So the umbilical arteries are intact because they sort of run a different way through the body, but the umbilical vein you have to cut because there's no other way to get that out of the way. So this is not completely ready to be looked at and graded. I have to clean it up, make everything visible. Your goal is to get all of the organs visible on the list. And the first couple of them, the umbilical vein and the arteries and the peritoneum, I've already talked about those. The next one, the diaphragm, is going to be up at the top of the abdominal cavity next to the rib cage. The diaphragm is a sheet of muscle that contracts for breathing, and so you'll find it as a sheet of muscle up here, so I'd have to do a little cleaning to make that visible on this. The liver is going to be pretty distinctive. It's the largest, mass of tissue you'll find in the body. And the color will vary. The sort of reddish brown color we associate with livers is pretty common, but you'll oftentimes also see these splotches of blue or pink. That's the dye that was injected into the circulatory system. Oftentimes those blood vessels rupture and you end up with hopefully just splotches of dye. Sometimes you end up with exploded cavities. Well, hopefully that won't happen. We'll deal with that if it's got that. So that would be the liver. The gallbladder, you guys know the gallbladder is associated with the liver, right? That's going to be found underneath it. It will be on the animal's right side. So you've got to keep your left, because you're looking at it from the front, you've got to flip left and right. So it's going to be pressed into the liver. If you guys can see it on this screen, it's kind of washed out. Let's see if I can adjust the contrast or anything else. That's really going to do much good. This is probably one that'll be easier to point out on your dissections versus me trying to show you on this thing. But there's a little deflated balloon that's sort of pressed into the bottom of the liver. That's the gallbladder. And that one important thing about the gallbladder, it's responsible for storing a chemical called bile that's involved in digesting fats. It does not produce it. The liver produces bile. The gallbladder just stores it. Next item on the list, the spleen, is going to be, you have to be careful with this so you don't confuse it with the liver. It's going to be sort of a tongue-like structure on the animal's left side, sort of curving around. It will oftentimes look very similar to the liver because they have very similar blood supply and similar tissue that make them up, so their appearance is similar. But the spleen is basically a gigantic lymph node, so it helps fight off infections, it recycles blood cells and things like that. Underneath the liver, you have the stomach, which will be, again, hard to see on this. It's not, the lighting is not going to let me work out. So I'm going to go through this fast so you can see it on your pigs and waste less time looking at this screen. You can't see much. But it's going to be a deflated bag underneath the liver. So the liver will have to be pushed up towards the rib cage. And when you do that, the spleen curves around the stomach on the left side. The stomach is deeper inside. But you'll be able to feel a sort of a squishy bag underneath the liver. On the stomach, you have two sphincters, which are muscles that control the ability of stuff to move in and out of the stomach. The esophageal sphincter is the one up at the top where the esophagus connects. That one you'll have to find by feel because the only way to see it is to remove a whole bunch of stuff we don't want to remove. So that'll be further up, but the esophageal sphincter is there to keep air from flowing into your stomach. If you know someone who can burp on command, they're basically forcing air through the esophageal sphincter and then burping it back out. The pyloric sphincter is at the end of the stomach where it connects to the intestines, and that you will initially at least probably find by feel more easily because it'll be a very thick, stiff region because it has a lot of muscle in it. So you'll follow the stomach is all squishy, and inside there's this hard little nodule at the very end. That's going to be your pyloric sphincter. And again, it's right here, but you probably can't even see it on the screen.
You said
Pyloric sphincter. So that's item 8B. When something is a subletter, that means it's part of the thing that it's underneath. So the esophageal sphincter and pyloric sphincter are part of the stomach. That's why they're indented underneath the stomach. The mesentery refers to a group of membranes that hold a lot of your abdominal organs in place. The easiest way to find that is just to pull your intestines and see that they're held together by this membrane that's got a lot of blood vessels and things in it. So as I go to try and pull the small intestines out, they don't come out easily. They unfold, but they don't unravel, hopefully. And that's because they have this sort of translucent membrane. You can sort of see my finger through it, the blue spot through it. That's the translucent part of the mesentery that's holding together the intestines. And then the small intestine is going to be the location where the majority of the chemical digestion occurs. This includes digestion of fats, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. So pretty much almost all your chemical digestion happens here. The small intestine is divided into 3 parts, but only one of them is really clearly identifiable on this dissection. That's going to be the duodenum. The duodenum is the first portion of the small intestine. It's about 1 inch long on a fetal pig. It's the part that receives the material coming from the stomach. The stomach is very acidic. The duodenum has to receive the chemicals from the stomach that are very acidic and neutralize that acid before it causes damage. So the job of the duodenum is to deal with the chemicals coming from the stomach, but not to really do much in the way of digestion. It neutralizes the acid and things like that.